we'd kind of crank our heart out there to get that aircraft going for half an hour or 45-minute ride around there. And of course, it was pretty cold, all bundled up, and the temperature was about 25 degrees. And it wasn't really too pleasant flying in the wintertime. I was always enthusiastic about it, but you kind of lost that as time went on. Well, George was principal of a superintendent of schools in Holton and Littleton at that time, and we got talking, and he thought it'd be nice to go visit schools up in Littleton Ridge with the aircraft. I'd land him right alongside the school. There was a nice field right there, below Clyde Haggerty's. So we took off and went up and landed there. Golly, when we landed, we broke the tail skid, come off the aircraft. Well, that was a predicament because the tail end of the aircraft drug in the snow, and it was pretty deep. It was about 3 feet deep up there. So we got some haywire over to the Fitz's barn and one thing or other, and I don't believe George did much visiting. We finally got the tail skid fixed. And by that time, got the engine started again before that cooled off. Get in the aircraft, but she wouldn't move. You could pour the juice right to her, and the skis were stuck solid in the snow. So I had to climb back out of there and pick up the tail end of that thing and rack it back and forth and loosen the skis up, and then run real fast and jump in the cockpit and give her the juice. And she'd get moving a little bit. So once she started moving, we kept her moving. I went up there and taxied around and took off, get back into the hangar and put away. And that was a long day too. And then, of course, in April we took our skis off and put on the wheels. And we continued flying along with the folks and so forth. About this time, I had around 175 hours. And I know in May of '34, I was out there one day and did a lot of loops with the Travel Air. I was up alone. I did 17. I got it here in my logbook. One right after another, continuous. I did 17 loops. I must have felt pretty good that day, I guess. And then Ralph and Bill and Alec, we talked with them, and they would like to go up and visit Lily, my sister, up in Washburn. So we thought we'd take a fly up there, which we did. And everything went fine. By golly, we purred up there, slicking a button. Nice day. I circled around his farm. There's a nice big strip to land on there, and I come down, and I never looked out the right-hand side of the aircraft. When I was learning to fly in Texas there, we always looked out the left, and you get in the habit of always looking out on the left when you're landing the aircraft. Well, I didn't notice a barbed wire fence that Bill had down there in the middle of that field to keep his cows in. Well, I looked out the left-hand aircraft, and we made a nice smooth landing and rolled along, and zing! Pretty soon, clickety-click, click, click, those fence posts began going through the bottom part of the Travel Air wing. Well, we stopped, and of course that broke a rib or two, tore the fabric, and there we were. Well, I called up Caribou. George Shaw, he was an old-time war pilot. Flew into Holton right at around 1919, 1920, right after the war. Used to do stunts and so forth and got $15 a trip. That's like getting $150 now. Well, he was over at the airport. Skip Tybert was over there, and one or two other fellows, and I talked with them on the aircraft, and they bundled all their stuff in the airplane, and they flew over to Washburn. And we made a little patch-up repair job, enough so we'd get off the ground. And then I was going to fly over to Caribou and have it finished. So that's what we did. Bill and Alec, I think, got in the aircraft, and we took off. And the wind was blowing out of the northwest about 6 or 7 miles an hour. Well, halfway down this field, the last half of the field, going toward the south, Bill had potatoes planted in it. And from the edge of that field up toward the north, it was hay, where we landed. Well, I figured I ought to take off into the wind, so I turned around there, and I aimed right straight for a telephone pole. Gave her the gun, and by George, we got going and going and going. The grass was a little deeper than I thought it was, and that pole was getting pretty darn close, and I still wasn't off the ground. But the tail was up off the air, and she was almost ready to fly. And I had to get up over those wires, so I pulled back on the stick, and up she went right straight on top, over the telephone wires, on top of the road. And when it got there, the airplane stalled. We was up about 40 feet. She just got pretty loose. And I eased the stick right ahead because it was over the wires at that time and pushed the nose down. I dropped right down on the other side of the road within 3 or 4 feet of the ground. Picked up the speed, flew over to Caribou, and everything was all right. Well, when those fellows flew back to Caribou, I'm telling you, and Bill Duncan told me afterwards that they were jumping and tearing the hair, and they said he'd never make it, he was going to crash. So you can see how good the Lord was to me through all the flying expenses. He was right there all the time. And a good many times I prayed to him too, and the prayers always have been answered. So that's a little story there, and that takes us up into the beginning of the summer of 1934. Now I'll just kind of speak about the marriage and the family of 34. I won't speak too much about flying just now. Ann and I got engaged, I think it was on her birthday, May the 19th in 1934. And we planned on getting married and so forth when I could take my vacation from the pumping station. I was working over there, of course, at that time. So July 23rd arrived, and we were married in the priest's house, in the Catholic Church in Halton, by Father Sullivan. And our folks was there, Father and Mother, and I think George and Bill and one or two of the others. I don't know whether Fern was there or not. But the Fitzpatrick boys were there and so forth. And our best man, of course, was Ellery Wilson, who was a very good friend of mine all the way through. And Anna had as her bridesmaid Teresa, her sister, Teresa Fitzpatrick. So the four of us stood up there, and it didn't take too long. We got married anyway. And from the union, I'll just run through the children there so that there'll be a record of it. Betty, our firstborn, was born June the 15th in 1936 in Halton, Maine. And she was baptized by Reverend J.S. Sullivan on the 5th of July, 1936 in Halton at St. Mary's Church, of course. And Richard Eugene, he was born on February the 21st in Halton, Maine, baptized by Father Sullivan, March the 13th, 1938 in Halton. And then our number 2 daughter, Anne Marie, was born in Winthrop, Massachusetts on June the 11th, 1941, and she was baptized by Father Carroll at the St. John Evangelist Church in Winthrop on July the 6th, 1941. By that time, the reason that we was down there, of course, I was flying with the airline at that time, and we lived in Winthrop, but more about that a little bit later. And Thomas A. Alexander Cumming was born May the 10th of 1951 in Winchester, Mass., and he was baptized June the 3rd, 1951, by Father Walsh at St. Mary's Parish in Winchester. John, he was born February the 20th, 1953 in Winchester. And I haven't got any records of his baptism here in the Bible. I guess he missed that occasion. Not really. I think I neglected to put it down, and I don't have that date. And Betty was confirmed by Archbishop Cushing, and Richard and Anne Marie was confirmed by Archbishop Cushing on June the 8th. I don't know the dates for Betty and Richard. Thomas received his confirmation from Bishop Feeney at Sanford, Maine, because he was going to school there at the Christian Brothers school in Alfred. And John Irvin, he was confirmed on May the 10th, 1964 in Norway. And I was also confirmed at that date with John on May the 10th, 1964 in Norway. And I just forget the name of the priest there. He was an old fella anyway, and of course Bishop Feeney probably come out to do that. So that's just a little record there. Now to go back just a little bit to 1934 again. Of course, by this time Jimmy Colton and Bill Stanislaw, who was flying out of the North Road, had moved over into Drake's Field, and they had separated their partnership, and Stanislaw went on up to Presque Isle. to run that airport. And Jim started flying out of just north of Portland, or east of Portland, east of Holton there, in Drake's Hill, going up that hill, right on top of the hill, Mutton Hill we used to call it. And he had to land one way and take off the other. And he gave some student instruction there and carried passengers and so forth. And I come over there with my airplane on one occasion and landed and carried some passengers. I think it was around July sometime. But it was never too enticing to me because I didn't have any brakes and I had to land uphill and take off down, and it was kind of rough. And I didn't particularly care for it too much. But I know on one occasion in the evening, Jim said he was going to do some night flying. Now he had a Waco, a J4 Waco, I think it was, biplane. There's a new one too. F, was that an F? I don't know. But anyway, he said he was going to do some flying, so by golly, we get in that airplane. We taped a couple of flashlights onto each wing, and we got 3 or 4 cars down at the foot of the runway, at the bottom of the hill, and a couple on the left-hand side going up the hill. And that was my first night flight with Jim. He was the pilot, and I was just a passenger. We went up and flew around Holton, and by golly, it was spectacular. It was beautiful. It's the first time I ever seen street lights and houses and stores and everything all lit up, and it was fine. Well, we come back to land and made out okay, but I'll tell you, I wouldn't want to do that now. That was quite something. We come in over those cars, of course. The flashlights, you might just well be holding a match and trying to look at well, I don't know what. You couldn't see anything with those things. So it was a case of kind of feeling the ground out. But that was the first night flight up there, and that was in June 1934, I think. And then along in August, I had the town manager of Presque Isle, Adams, and another chap, and they wanted to go down to Augusta. They had a meeting down there, and they asked me if I'd take them down, and I agreed because the money looked pretty good to me, and we flew down to Augusta. I landed at Bangor because one of the boys had to go into the men's room down there, and he couldn't wait any longer, so we landed at Bangor anyway, and he accomplished his problem and finished it and so forth, and we went on to Augusta. Well, when I got to Augusta, there was quite a crowd there. And, of course, that was a tired runway in Augusta, and it was downhill a little bit, too. And it was the day that Amelia Earhart had landed in Augusta. It was 14th of August. And, by George, I come in and landed. And I'm telling you, after I hit the ground, I thought I picked up speed and was going faster and faster. And I could see right away that I was going to run out of runway. So I eased her over into the dirt off the runway onto the grass strip there where the tail skid could bite into the soil and get stopped. And we did, all right. But you know, there's been other times when I didn't know whether we was going to stop with that airplane before we come to the field, and I was standing up in the cockpit, and occasionally I would jump out, and while that aircraft was still rolling, hang onto the side of the cockpit, by the pilot's cockpit there, and grab the handle on the tail of the aircraft and lift it and give it a big, huge twist. And throw it around 180 degrees so that we wouldn't run out of runway. I've done that a good many times. Well, later on in 34, Pete Dombeck and Ralph Porter and I got together, and we decided we'd go over hunting over to Matagamon and land on the field. There was a beautiful hay field over there that they used to use to raise hay and feed the horses and so forth when there was logging and wintering in there. Now, Matagamon is probably about 35, 40 miles west of Patton. It's all woods, nothing but woods, except for this field. And I'd heard about it through Jim Colton and so forth. So we took off one morning and went over there to have a little hunt, and we accomplished that. But on the takeoff, the wind was coming down. It's right alongside of Catardon, you know. The wind was coming down the hills and the mountains there, and I took off into the wind, and we kind of get a little downdraft, and I had a tough time to pull out over that thing, and it was still quite memorable yet, and Ralph Porter and Pete Dombeck remembers it to this day. Well, just about this time, I went up and got my transport license up to Presque Isle. Hoyt made a trip once a year from Boston up through here. He was the only inspector in New England. And we got that, had to do spins and all the paraphernalia that goes with the transport. And I had just a little bit over 200 hours, I think it was, 205 or 6 hours, something of that nature. Well, in the fall of 34, we put the aircraft on skis again. And in February of 35, 21st of February, according to my logbook, a couple of fellows come and see me about taking them into Chase Pond. They were trappers. They wanted to go in there through the month of February and trap and have me bring in some supplies and so forth to them. And we agreed with that and went out and got paraphernalia loaded into the aircraft. And of course it's midwinter, cold, got that started. By golly, on the takeoff, I went down over, there was a little ditch there in the field, and went a little bit sideways there and broke that tail skid off. And there I was. I couldn't, I didn't want to go to the lake with that tail skid broken again. That was the second time it broke on me. So we had to cancel the flight, and I guess the boys went and got somebody else to take him in because I never did hear from them after that. I do know I was working over to the pumping station at that time, and I got a call in April the 3rd in 35 from some people in Patton who said that there was a lady in Matagamon Lake by the name of Mrs. Myrack. Now the Myracks run the camp there, sporting camp and so forth, and this was just across from this hayfield that I speak of that we went hunting in. And she was hemorrhaging there, and they was afraid she was going to bleed to death unless they could get a doctor in. Well, there was a CCC camp, the Conservation Corps, Civilian Conservation Corps, they called it at that time, to put everybody to work. That was during the Depression, of course. And the young fellows worked there and got a job, and they lived sort of an army life. And they'd made arrangements for me to pick up a doctor and fly him in if I would go to Shin Pond and land at Shin Pond and pick this doctor up. Well, I agreed, and I had to get somebody to work for me at the pumping station, and took off. And I get into Shin Pond about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. It was almost, well, it wasn't dark because that was in April. And the ice was still in the lake. I landed on the ice, of course, but there were snow squalls coming up. And from what I know now, there was going to be a cold front pass through. But anyway, it began snowing pretty hard. The doctor didn't arrive, and I waited and waited and waited. And for about an hour, and he finally came. And by that time, it was the visibility was right down to zero almost, and it was snowing like a son of a gun. Well, I couldn't go in that condition, so we stayed at the camp. There was some people there that come out onto the ice when I taxied in there. Said that we were welcome to stay there, and we did. Stayed there all night, had supper and breakfast in the morning, and then I had to get out and get that aircraft started. I did have a pot with me in case we needed it up to Matagamon. I put that in the baggage compartment there. So we used that, got it heated up, got the oil. I think I drained the oil out and brought it into the camp before we went to bed so that would at least be warm. And we made our continued next morning. It was, I'm telling you, the cold front went through, but the wind was blowing about 30 miles an hour and rough and gusty. I took off from there, and as soon as we got in the air, we went up about 1,000 feet, I think. My golly, the air was good, and it was heavy. It wasn't too far, only 30 miles in there to the lake, so we made that without any difficulty. But there was a great number of snow squalls around. So I come in and circled along close to the shore where the Matagamon camp was, and there was a snow squall that was hit just about that time. And I landed from the shore out into the wind, that is, out toward the lake. By golly, I landed there and was taxiing, and the snow squall stopped. And I would say probably 100 or 200 feet ahead of me somewhere, there was nothing but black water. Wow-de-dow. I never thought there would be an open spot in the water by that time of year, but there was. So we taxied back, and the doctor was in there for an hour or two and something like that nature, and helped the lady out. And then we went back to Shin Pond, and of course come back into Halton. Now they were thinking of building an airport in Halton. The WPA, Workmen's project there, association and so forth, was in full swing to give work to all the men that was out of work and so forth. It was a government project, one of the first that started up. I know they was building the road going out to the lake there, and they was doing it with wheelbarrows and shovels, putting gravel on the road and so forth. Pretty slow process, but it put in 50, 60 men to work. Well, they wanted an airport in Halton, and Joe Gorham and I surveyed out around where I was. Of course, the Peabody Field was a beautiful field. It's quite a little ways out of town, but it was level and it was flat. But at the same token, it was potato land. The potato land being very valuable at that time was around $200 an acre, and they would have had to buy a couple of hundred acres anyway, and possibly move a portion of the road to have an airport in there. So it was brought up before the town officials, and Jimmy Pierce owned some property over toward the boundary line, right where the present airport is located now. And I think he donated that to the town if they wanted to use it for an airport, so that they got the land for nothing, or nearly nothing. I'm not sure of that donation, but it wasn't very much. And it was nothing but a swamp down in between two hills, and I never thought too much of it, and I don't think Jimmy did either. But anyway, they bought that piece, and they started clearing the land and building a dirt runway, north and south runway, from the road on down. And in July 1935, July the 7th, as a matter of fact, I landed on that airport, and that was the first time that I'd landed there. I think Jimmy was already there. He'd moved his hangar over, and he was flying out of there. So I, of course, had to make arrangements to move my hangar and get organized at the new airport. Well, all the Fitzpatricks come down, and Stanley Wright and Guy Smith, and I got trucks and trailers from the water company, and I worked quite a bit before this, that is, before the actual moving date, to take the boards off the top and save everything and mark it and take the posts out. But we got it moved anyway and brought it over to the airport, and I erected it all up again. Had to put up gin poles to raise up the beams in the center of the hangar and so forth. So it was right alongside of Colton's, and it was down in the middle of the field. You had to drive down the runway, probably 1,500 feet down the runway, and turn off to the left. And you'd come to my hangar and to his hangar too. So we started flying out of the airport about that time. I haven't got it exactly pinned down to the day, month, and date, with the exceptions of the time we landed at the new airport. Of course, I was working at the pumping station then, and the town was having a great uproar over Tom Packard. He was in as a town manager, and he wanted to take over the Halton Water Company and have something to do with it, and I'm telling you, it was some fuss. And as a result of that, Bert McIntyre, who was in the charge of the water company, resigned. My father had worked there for about 40 years, and if Bert left, my father couldn't see eye to eye with Packard and how he was going, and he resigned at that same time in 1935. Well, Tom also did away with one of the jobs at the pumping station, which left me without a job. So I went out to Ralph Porter's. He run a garage at that time out in Carey's Mills, and I was going to get $12 a week there. He said he could pay me if he still kept getting business and so forth. Well, I worked there just one day, and Guy Smith rolled up with his car. Now, Guy Smith was a fellow that I'd worked with on the line crew and the water company and so forth, and he'd taken over Father's job. Well, they needed somebody to read meters. And they needed it right away because they didn't have anybody, and I had read meters prior to that. So I knew about it and so forth. Well, I drove up to the house and talked with Father about it, see if he had any objections and so forth. And of course, I just getting started, and he was just finishing. He didn't have any objections, said it'd be okay. He didn't bother him too much. So I went to work for the water company as a meter reader. And I stayed on that job for 2 or 3 months. And finally, Tom Stanchel, who was a local fellow there and went to the University of Maine, graduated, and he got a job at the Holton Water Company. And the chap by the name of Norman Mullen became the superintendent of the water company. Bert McIntyre had left, of course. And when Tom came, they gave him the job of reading meters, and I went out doing line work again, which I always loved. I loved climbing poles and stringing the wire and hanging the transformers and being out in the truck and so forth. So I went doing that somewheres along in the latter part of 1935 and through the winter of 35 also. And along with that, on the side, I was mapping the lines. Mullen had asked me if I would take stock of all the power lines and the cross arms and transformers and everything, and number the poles, and put them on a map so that they could go to the book and see what they had on different roads and what they would need and so forth. So I did that through that winter of 35 and the first part of 36. And Tom and I got talking a little bit about going in business, and I was interested in swapping in getting a smaller airplane. It cost too much to run that Travel Air, and it really wasn't too good in that respect. And they had some light little aircraft come out, and I'd talked with Wes Martin down in Waterville. He had an Eaglet with a Zeekley engine in it. That's a little two-passenger plane, real parasol type, all open cockpit. And by golly, I bought that. I swapped the Travel Air in, and I bought that around, I guess it was in 36, somewhere along in there, 1936. I didn't fly too much through that winter of 35 and the beginning of 36. And I think I got $350 or $400 for the Travel Air, and it was just about an even swap with the Eaglet. And I started carrying a few passengers there through August and September. That was one of my first forced landings with a passenger in there that was successful. I had taken off from the airport, the new airport, of course. The runway wasn't too long. And golly, I only get up a little ways, maybe 40, 50 feet, and the engine, she started coughing and spitting and banging and so forth, and I wasn't getting any power out of it. And this time I held her straight ahead and went across a little swamp, landed in a little small field with the girl that was with me. She was the passenger that was paying for the ride, and there we sat. And she asked me, she said, "Is this the end of the ride? Is this all I get?" She, of course, didn't realize that we'd had engine problems. Well, by golly, we had a problem getting that aircraft back onto the runway. We had to go over this swamp where they cut all the trees, and every tree was up, the stump was up about 1.5 feet. And we laid planks and so forth, and finally got back into the airport. And I started giving Tom Stanchel a little bit of a dual time. Well, Wes Martin flew up again in the first part of 1937, and the Taylor Cub had just come out then. I want you to note that I say a Taylor Cub, not a Piper Cub, but a Taylor Cub. And that was a 40 horsepower Warner engine in there, 40 horsepower. Well, boy, I thought that was great. And Tom looked at it and so forth. We decided that we'd go in business. And this new aircraft cost $1,200. Well, I'd get a couple of $300 out of the Eaglet. And we needed, I think, about $1,000. So we talked with Tom's father, and he lent us the money, drew up a note, so much interest, so much a month, and so forth. So we sat down and started our partnership in 1937. And we took delivery of that aircraft in May of 1937, May 17th, and the license number was 17938. And I went along with Tom, of course, giving him student instruction, and up to the point of his solo. And we soloed Tom on the June the 19th, and that's just about a month after we got the aircraft. And I was pretty excited too, because it was my first student. Of course, there was nothing written then of how to instruct or teach students at all in flying. You had to kind of make up your own course and so forth, that which we did. And I finally did get some books from Tex Rankin. Now, he was a great stunt pilot along in that era, and he had written something about learning to fly, and I read those books, and as I recall, I started right in with the student, letting him take right off the first shot. Put the hand on the stick and his feet on the rudders, and I'd say keep it straight, of course. And as we'd take off down the runway, and he'd do a fair job, but he'd get used to that. And the same with landing. Come in there and try to see how you were doing right off quick. We'd go up in the air, and I would roll the stick around, and we would do banks and turns and so forth like that, and that's about it. And then at the end of the 6, 7, 8 hours, somewhere along in there, we'd start doing pattern flying around the airport, and so that they knew about where they was going to cut the engine and come in for a landing. Also conducted the emergency flights. I used to pull the throttle on them and so forth when you're flying around, let them pick out a field and come in. It went quite well. And we had quite a number of students. I soloed quite a few. I soloed Hillis Cunliffe, and also soloed Linwood Lawrence, and a fellow by the name of Lambert. And there was two Durling boys from over in Canada that come over and took courses, and they later bought an airplane from him. I soloed Garth Noyce. I thought he was an old man at that time. He was, in his mid-50s, but by golly, he learned to fly. And of course, Tom's father, he took instructions with us. I suppose just more or less to help us out, probably. But he wouldn't solo. He just never had courage enough, either in me or himself, so that he wouldn't solo at all. And that's the way she went along there through 1937. Well, now, let me see. I'm just trying to think. We moved, about that time from High Street over to the Chamberlain House on Elm Street, which was almost across from Father's. They were renting that and so forth, and I moved over there, Anna and I. And Betty was small, of course, and as a matter of fact, Dick was born in that house in 1938 in February, as we mentioned before. So that took place along in there. And Tom hopped some passengers. He got his license eventually, and Albert Robichaud, he used to fly. I soloed him. He got his license, and Orrin Gentle was another one. And along about that time, Hillis Cunliffe used to be out to the airport, hanging around there all the time. We gave him some time anyway. And he was very interested in parachute jumping. And he had two parachutes. He had a backpack, or a seat pack, and he had a chest pack for a spare that he'd bought from a fellow over in Woodstock. And he'd watch them pack those chutes quite a bit. So he'd stand out in the airport, a bunch of us around there in the evening and one thing or other, and he'd pull this ripcord when there's a good wind blowing, and the chute would fill up, and he would take a hold of the shroud lines and pull back and forth and one thing or other. We got to kidding him, of course, and said, how about going up and making a jump, Hillis? And I said, oh, sure, Hillis, come on, I'll take you up. Well, by golly, he agreed one night. There was about there wasn't many out there, 4 or 5 fellas, and Hillis and I, and Tom Stanchel, and 4 or 5 more. And by golly, Hillis get in the, let me see, Hillis get in the front seat, yep, of that. That was the first closed airplane that I ever had. It had a little door and you could button it up, and I thought that was great, But anyway, we took off, and I wanted to climb up to about 3,000 feet, so we'd have enough room to jump. And the closer we got, pretty slow climbing, with 40 horsepower and 2 fellas in there. Closer we got to 3,000, I looked at Hillis and the whiter he became, and I wasn't too happy about that time either, because I wondered if something went wrong, in your own hometown, and you let a fella jump, you're liable to be in the soup. But anyway, I said to Hillis, now look, we can get back down, and forget about the guys kind of plaguing you a little bit and so forth, and don't bother jumping. Well, no, he said he was going to jump. So, away we went, and he climbed out onto the wheel there, and he took off. Well, of course, the minute he jumped and left the aircraft, you had no sense of depth of perception at all, and I could see him, he was turning end over end, and I could see him fumbling and frigging around there every time his face come side up so that I could see it. And about 2,000 feet, I thought, my Lord, he isn't going to open that chute up. And this was in September the 17th. Well, pretty soon that chute blossomed out. And by golly, I was happy, and so was Hillis. And he landed on the airport there. And Tom Packard was out there. And Hillis was just in 10th heaven. I'll tell you, time I get down and landed, he landed before I did, of course. Well, after that, we decided that we'd put on a show on Sundays and bring in a lot of passengers and so forth, and we'd give rides, and Hillis would pass the hat just before he made the jump and get a little collection. That's what they did there, of course. And we started doing that. Well, the first thing that we did on that Sunday, after we got through hopping passengers, he made the collection. We took off and only went up to, I guess we went up to about 2,000 feet that time. Well, by golly, out he went. He was going to hit the airport. And he missed the airport, and there were some high-tension wires, 2,300 volts running along there, going out to the customs office on the lines. And he just missed those when he was coming down to land. Of course, I didn't see this. I knew about it afterwards. And he landed in the middle of a road in front of a car that was coming. Well, by golly, Tom and I began to talk about that, and that was too close for us, so we cut that out, and we never took Hillis up again. But you know, Hillis went on and went down through to Virginia and so forth, and joined a group there and jumped. I forget how many jumps he's got, and he got into aviation, started to fly. As a matter of fact, he called me on the telephone just a few weeks ago here in 1983. Well, I guess it may have been January of 84. And we had a little chat and so forth. So he's retired now and doing quite well. So that kind of brings us up in here to 1937. And I might say that about this time, we got wind of the Boston Maine Airways going to increase their schedule from Bangor up through to Millinocket to Holton to Presque Isle to Caribou. Well, I was pretty interested in that, working for the water company. I thought, by golly, that would be pretty slick for me. So I went down and saw, I went to Boston. Some way or other, I just forget whether I went by train or somebody took me down by car, or just how it was. But I talked with old man Hoyt there, who had taken my license away at one time for 3 months for that first crack-up we had. And he put in a good word for me, and by golly, they hired me as a station agent. So I resigned from the Holton Water Company and went over to the airport full-time with Boston Maine Airways in Central Vermont. They called it Boston Maine Central Vermont Airways at that time. And, of course, it was run by the railroad. And they put up a building there and installed the radios and so forth. And I was able to really do flying, hopping passengers, and give student instruction while I was working there. We only had the 2 flights a day, that is one northbound and one southbound at that time, and they flew a Stinson trimotor come in there. And it made it pretty good. A little later on, they put in some fuel so that they could refuel at Holton. So in the wintertime, of course, I didn't fly with the Cub. We didn't fly that in the wintertime. And I went, it was in August, I think, of 1937 that I went with Boston Maine Airways, which later became Northeast Airlines. So through the winter, we kind of had problems with our car, too, and I walked out there every day. I put up my lunch, Anna did, and I'd walk up Pleasant Street, and crossed over into Maine, and up over the hill, and down into the airport, and so forth. And I was very interested in photography at that time. And Garth Noyce used to work over at the B&A, Bangor and Aroostook Railroad. And during his noon hour, he always come out to the airport. And we talked photography, and from that was, I suppose, the fact that he wanted to fly. Eventually he did and bought this airplane of ours, this Cub, NC-17938. He bought that when I went down through to Bangor. So in 1938, just before we went down, I think, to Bangor, Was that 38 or 39? But anyway, in 38, they decided they was going to have airmail week. All over the country, all over the United States, going to be airmail week. Well, we made arrangements with Mars Hill and Patton and Holton to fly the mail down to Holton and land just prior to when Boston Maine Airways would be coming southbound and would take the mail on down. So we flew over to Patton, and they had a big parade there and come out with the mail and put it on that little cub of ours, and we flew from there to Mars Hill, landed in the field up there, and the same thing took place and come back to Holton. I think I got the flying time of 2 hours and 20 minutes. And that's the first airmail that was ever taken out of those places, and we got letters here that was mailed there and so forth. And then I later got a nice plaque or a certificate from James Farley, who was the postmaster then with under Roosevelt, under Franklin Roosevelt. I got that hanging there in my den. That was kind of interesting, something to think about. It's just part of history in those early days, I guess you might say. So let me see. We continued to fly through the rest of the year of 1938. Did an awful lot of flying, a lot of passenger flying. I flew 40 passengers on one Sunday. Now, we only got $1 for passengers, and I thought we really struck oil that day. But I had a bunch in the side of my backbone there. I sat in there for about 7 or 8 hours, and it was pretty strenuous there on that occasion, and did a lot of instruction, saw a lot of students and so forth. And our flight course consisted of guaranteed solo for $50. And we had a little sign we put on the back of the car that said that, and that's just exactly what we did. We gave those people guaranteed solo for $50. And we got quite a darn good number of students, and a good lot of people used to come out and check into the airport and so forth. There was 2 or 3 other aircrafts that landed there at that time, and incidentally, Jim Colton had left a year or 2 before. He smashed up his cabin Waco, taken off one snowy, sticky day up in Burge Field, and he couldn't get in the air, but he just about did get in the air off the peak of one hill and glided over and smashed into the peak of another. And that was the end of Jim Colton in Holton. As far as I know, he's never did any flying since then back there. But we had other little aircrafts come in. There was some Arancas come in there. And we had the 2 Cubs at that time. One belonged to the Durling boys, and business was kind of picking up and so forth. And I was still surveying the lines, for the water company on the side. Mother, Anna, used to come with me, and she'd drive the car, and I'd get out and stamp the poles, and I forget what I got. I think it was 30-some cents an hour, 35 cents an hour or something of that nature. And I drew the maps while I was there at the station at the airport in the little building that the Boston Maine Airways had. Of course, we used to have radio failures, and Bing Crosby used to come up, that's William Crosby from Bangor, and fix the radiators. And we had just a real good time looking at it, and it was quite nice. Occasionally, I'd split wood out there. I'd bring a carload of wood out, and while I didn't have anything to do, I'd go out and split my own wood and pile it back in the car. I also taught myself to typewrite. And also in there, the Weather Bureau decided that they would have 6 hourly weather reports. And they asked me if I would be the operator of that. And I, of course, accepted because I think they paid $3 a day. Well, that was really something because I was getting $21 a week then on top of what I got for the Boston Maine Airways, which was $80 a month. They only paid us twice a month, and it wasn't a weekly pay. It was $80 a month. So if I got this other $80 a month, that would be pretty darn good. The only thing is I had to take those weather reports every 6 hours. I took them at 2 in the morning, 8 o'clock in the morning, 2 in the afternoon, and 8 o'clock in the evening. So I used to have to set the alarm clock at 1 o'clock or 1:30 and go out to the airport, take those weather readings, call up the dispatcher over to the Bangor and Aroostook Railroad, and he'd send those down to Bangor by telegraphy and telegraph. And that's the way the first weather reports were taken there in Holton at that time. And